If you've ever sat down and been like, okay, I want to become a better version of myself, love who I am, and there are some ways in which I want to change that would make me happier and make me feel better day to day. In this podcast episode, I want to talk about the one ingredient that I think is most often missed whenever anyone does any kind of glow up effort, whether you're doing, 75 hard, which I have thoughts about that I won't talk about in this podcast episode, or you're just creating a vision board and setting goals or writing down, who you want to become. This is the one ingredient that I feel like if you miss it, you will forever not be able to get to that future self version of you. And this ingredient is embarrassing, I will say. It's kind of vulnerable to do. You probably won't want to do it once you've heard about it. Welcome to Grow With Intention, the podcast for people who want to create a life that feels good. I drop a little mini episode every other week talking about glowing up your life, productivity, all the good stuff. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. So the other night I was with Luke. I was watching an episode of The Better Sister, pizza in hand, when I saw the lawyer on the TV show do something kind of weird. She is talking to the prime suspect in a murder case, a person who obviously needs to protect themselves and not say anything silly. And she goes, hey, before talking to anyone, make sure that I'm there. Logical, makes sense. Don't go talking about the crime that you've been accused of doing. But then she followed that up by saying, okay, now say it 10 times. I will not speak without my lawyer present. I'm not talking without my lawyer. And then you see this guy sitting there and he's repeating that line over and over again. I'm not talking without my lawyer. And it's uncomfortable to watch. The energy that I get from that scene is like very high stakes version of putting on a name tag at a corporate networking event. Like it's just uncomfortable and a little bit vulnerable. Obviously helpful. Like I can see how that's helpful. Oddly embarrassing. After watching that, I turned to my partner, Luke, very patient man, and I was like, do we think the lawyers are actually out there doing this? Because it makes a lot of sense to me, but are they actually doing it? And it turns out, yes, a lot of them are. Attorneys, according to the internet, will sometimes role play lines with clients, especially lines like, I'm not talking without my lawyer. Because otherwise clients will impulsively just start saying things. It is unnatural to say things like, I'm not speaking without my lawyer. It's unnatural to not answer a question when asked. It doesn't feel right for any human being to do that. And after a few minutes of reps over role play, the clients seem to get it, it clicks. It feels a lot more natural for them to not just respond to a question, to instead respond with their rehearsed line. Obviously, this podcast is not about how to respond when you're accused of a crime. And I also will say, if you're not in a marginalized community, a lot of marginalized communities actually have to teach their children how to respond if accused of a crime or even just held up in a police stop. So I know that I'm talking from a place of privilege here. I'm aware of it. It's horrendous. But what this podcast is about is the awkwardness of change and the need for repetition and practice if you ever want to become a better version of yourself. If you want to do something that currently to you feels unnatural and awkward, you are going to have to put in practice. You are going to have to put in the rep. Because if people who are committed of a crime, who quite literally it would be life-saving for them to not speak without their lawyer present, still need to practice that line in order to embed it in their brain, you too require practice, require putting in the reps, require maybe even a little bit of role play in order to start acting in ways that are different to the ways that you currently behave. And I think we're all pretty open to practicing when it comes to big stuff. Like everyone acknowledges you want to get better at tennis, put in the reps. If you want to learn a new language, you're going to have to put in some time to repeat things over and over again and practice. But when it comes to little things like, okay, I want to become a person who's tidy, you expect yourself to just do it without really practicing. Or if you want to get better at, saying no and not immediately agreeing to every request that comes your way, you need to practice because that's going to feel unnatural, uncomfortable, and awkward to you at first. Something I've even talked about in my videos on waking up earlier is that if you want to wake up earlier, you want to wake up to an alarm without snoozing, you kind of want to practice waking up to the alarm without snoozing. Like practice those really automatic behaviors in the morning of turning off your alarm, walking to brush your teeth. It sounds kind of silly and it's helpful. And I think there are a few reasons why we don't practice. I think firstly, a lot of us just assume that we should get things. It's kind of like how people go into parenting and they're like, well, you should just naturally know how to parent. If that were true, a lot of people would have had a way better life experience. A lot of things do not come naturally to us that we assume should come naturally to us. Secondly, I think that people don't practice because it's embarrassing and it's vulnerable and it's awkward, especially if you are practicing lines. For example, oh, I'd love to, but I have to think about that. Like, let me get back to you on those plans. It feels awkward to sit there on your own or in your car, saying that stuff out loud. It's vulnerable, it's embarrassing, it's trying. And past school, a lot of us don't really enjoy being seen trying. And because of all of that, you don't practice. Then you get grumpy at yourself when you don't just naturally change, even though you never put in the effort to put in any reps or practice at all. If someone came to you and said, oh, like, I want to get better at tennis, but it's just not happening, you would ask them, like, well, what are you doing? Like, are you putting in the hours? If they then said, oh no, I just want to get better at tennis, you'd be like, okay. So let's talk about how to practice well. Number one, if it makes sense, try physical practice. Habit formation in general for complex behaviors, for example, working out, it's still under question. They're not really sure if you can make that a habit. But there are littler physical things, muscle memory, that you can turn into a habit, like turning on a car or getting out of bed when your alarm goes off. Or I would say putting your coat on the new coat rack instead of putting it on the floor. There are little physical movements that for sure, if you practice them over and over again, you can embed them into your brain. Which moves me to step 2. Practice the inner stuff to where it's applicable. For example, if you're a fantasy writer and you want to get good at giving people a little mini elevator pitch whenever they ask, but right now, when people ask, what's your book about, you panic and you just bumble out a few words, you're going to need to develop a new way of responding to that inner feeling of panic, which also feeds into number 3, which is mental rehearsal. So mental rehearsal just means imagining yourself acting or responding to something in a different, more intentional way. For example, if you're trying to become a more confident person, you might actually every night just re-envision your day and little moments where you're like, I wish I had approached that with a little bit more confidence. You can replay that event out in your mind from a first person perspective. Imagine yourself feeling all the feelings that you were feeling in that moment. Pick a new response to those feelings and then pick a new way of behaving. And number 4, consider just heightening your awareness of behavior. One of my go-to lines is, when you change the way you react to things change. I usually talk about this in the context of emotions. If you change the way you react to your feelings of anger, the anger will change. Same goes for everyday behaviors and experiences. If you change the way you respond to your current behavior in the moment and you heighten your awareness of it without any judgment, you just kind of accept it, but you really notice it, things just tend to change. So I think of this as acceptance-based change. What you accept tends to evolve. Absolutely no judgment should be applied, because as soon as you apply judgment, as soon as you feel any shame, you stunt your progress. But just heightening your awareness generally with complete acceptance tends to lead to change and transformation on its own. At the end of each podcast episode, I like to do Recs of the Week to give you recommendations for resources that you can look into to dive deeper into today's podcast episode topics. The Rec of the Week this week is MuchelleB, The Joy Choice, because in that she talks about one mental habit that I think is really worth practicing. That's mental flexibility, something I've talked about before. And I recommend MuchelleB all the time because she is fantastic. If you like my stuff, you will like MuchelleB stuff. I'm going to have that linked in the description, in the show notes. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you soon.